So it's so good to be back here at Ocean of Compassion Buddhist Center. It's quite a few years, I think, since I was here, because the last time was before the pandemic, maybe 2018 or 19, somewhere in there. So thank you, Bay, for inviting me back to do this teaching. So let's start with a little meditation. It's always good to spend a little time in meditation and kind of focus our minds a bit. We all have busy lives, so it's important to spend a little time kind of working with the breath just to calm the mind, let go of whatever distractions we might have. And then it's also important for us to set our motivation for our time together. So we'll begin with just, again, a few minutes of focusing on the breath. You can choose whatever technique you prefer to work with the breath. And then I'll come in and we'll do a short guided meditation in order to set our motivation. Okay, so I'll ring the chime to begin that. And now to set our motivation, I thought it would be useful for each of us to take a few minutes, kind of explore our own experience around things that are difficult in our lives, challenging people, situations that can be kind of hard for us, can challenge us. And what is your habitual reaction to those? When things come into your life that are kind of tough to deal with, to what degree do you embrace them? Or to what degree do you find yourself drawn to reject them, to kind of push them out of your life? Again, won't be any reports on this. This is just for your own personal investigation, just to assess how you are with difficult situations. Recall your own experiences and be honest with yourself in assessing to what degree do you embrace the unwanted, the difficult, the unwelcome. And no matter how each of us may have assessed our own ability to work with those things that are difficult, we all have work to do. We all have things we can learn and develop greater skill and ability. So set an intention that starts with yourself, and with recognizing that when we are greater capable at dealing with difficult people and situations, we become a greater, uh, kind of find a greater source of calm within ourselves. We're able to be more in control, if you will, have a deeper peace. And there's great benefit to that because then we aren't bent out of shape by those situations. So really want to be here for yourself, to be able to work from that place of calm and peace with whatever it is that you meet, with greater understanding. But of course, we're also interacting with others at those times. So we can think about the other beings, those that we have been in conflict with, those that we may still have conflict with, as well as all beings. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the time we spent today could benefit them, could actually become a greater source of well-being for those beings? So as usual, we try to hold both of these as part of our motivation. The need to benefit ourselves and develop our own abilities so that we can then be of greater benefit to others, and hold that thought for being here today. I should say hello to all the dear friends on Zoom. I see Earth. Hello, Earth. Worked with Earth many times before in the past, even during the pandemic, some online courses. So anyway, so when I was invited to do this talk by Bay, of course, uh, many traditional teachings that feed into this, but I also want to try to work with kind of more kind of approaches that we could use in a very practical way as well. So what I'm going to do is kind of approach it from two angles, this whole topic. First, from the point of view of the more traditional Tibetan Buddhist teachings, working with this whole concept of mind training or lojong that many of you are familiar with, but it's something that is so rich and so valuable in our lives. If we learn some skill, some ability to use it, it can totally transform whatever it is that we're doing, whatever difficulties or conflicts we're experiencing. But I've also been doing a little bit of work in Santa Fe. One of my passions is to work with our interfaith group. We have an interfaith leadership alliance, and recently we become a nonviolent Santa Fe. We're a chapter of the Nonviolent Cities, a project that comes out of Pace Bene, a wonderful Catholic organization. And perhaps there's Nonviolent Campbell or Nonviolent San Jose. I don't know. I'm not keeping track of all the various cities that have kind of become charter organizations in this. But the idea is when you become a nonviolent city, then it's up to you to work on what projects are important for your community. And one of the things I've been working on is doing some training in exploring nonviolence. And of course, we're not going to talk a lot about nonviolence per se today, but some of the skills are the same. And how do we make sure that in our interactions with others, we're doing what we can to reduce violence, to reduce the potential for there to be conflict? And in our day and age, especially in the United States, we see how much this is needed, right? So anyway, I'm going to bring in some of that as well. But to start with, I want to start with a wonderful piece that I actually saw on Facebook. I don't remember which of my Facebook friends shared this with me, But I was really touched. This was just a couple of weeks ago that I saw this after I knew what I was going to be talking about here. And I said, this is a really nice story to start with. This gentleman here, his name is Daryl Davis. I don't know if you've heard the story of Daryl Davis. Is there anyone here who has? I hadn't either. I was so shocking to me because his story is so wonderful. Daryl Davis was once an aspiring and successful musician. He had played with Chuck Berry, B.B. King, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Muddy Waters. However, his true claim to fame, the legacy he has forged, came in a very different way. He went out of his way to befriend KKK Grand Wizard Roger Kelly. Of course, we all know of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that is still in the United States, hard to believe, but nonetheless, they are here. And he went out of his way to befriend this Grand Wizard. He spent years building trust between them and laying the foundation of what became a friendship. They broke bread at each other's tables. They welcomed each other into their homes. Davis even went as far as attending Klan rallies as a guest of Kelly. You can imagine, again, he's very clearly an African American man. And he's holding here the robes of probably Roger Kelly, though I saw a bit of a documentary on him, and he has dozens of robes that have been handed over to him by people who have left the KKK. So it says here, most importantly, Davis cultivated an atmosphere of listening. He didn't hate Kelly because Kelly hated him. Instead, he listened to Roger Kelly. And eventually, Kelly started listening to him. This led to the two realizing they had far more in common than not. In the end, Kelly denounced his ties to the KKK. So much so, he handed his hood and robe to Daryl Davis. In total, Davis has seen over 200 Klan members walk away from the KKK and hand over their robes and hoods to Daryl. Daryl Davis is a world changer, replacing hate with love, because love conquers hate every time. Kind of reminded me of that wonderful phrase from the Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha, where essentially he says, um, uh, hatred is never overcome by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal truth. It's so sad that we can hear that and it resonates so much with us, but it's still the world we live in obviously hasn't learned it yet. We keep using hatred to try to overcome hatred, violence to overcome violence. And this is the cycle that we're in. So with today's talk, I'm really hoping that we can just bring it down into kind of our own world, our own, who we deal with on a day-to-day basis. That's where change starts. After the 2016 election, when I was a bit desperate for like, what do I do with this energy around feeling like the country is moving in a direction, I need to do something. The advice I kept seeing from many Buddhist teachers, as well as even just in a general way, was you start right in your own little world. This is what we have to do, right? We can't change the world in the huge ways. Daryl Davis is changing his corner of the world to some degree and having a big impact, obviously, on other people that maybe go outside of his immediate circle. But, each of us has a responsibility to some degree to kind of take what we're learning and the way that we want to be in the world, that those teachings from the Buddha, that core that is at the heart of everything that we've learned, and make that active in our world. So this is my hope for today. I maybe can get on board with that, and we'll go from there. So again, in the first part of this, I do want to kind of talk a little bit more about these, again, lojong. Lojong, most of you have heard this phrase. It's Tibetan. Lo means mind or thought, and jong means transformation, kind of training. There are different aspects to these words. I won't go into all of that detail in terms of the Tibetan, but it's a very rich phrase. And we can say everything that the Buddha taught is mind training, because it's working with our minds. This is the Buddha's expertise, as Venerable Rabino always points out. She says, this is his stuff. This is what he actually taught on for all of his life, was how to change our minds. And mind here, again, is not our brains, though our brains are affected by our thoughts and our minds, as we've seen in neuroplasticity and all these wonderful things that are coming out in neuroscience. So again, this is the core of what the Buddha taught is to work with our minds, to change the patterns that we have, whether we're talking about interacting with challenging people or whatever situation, is to actually embrace those things that will help us to be more grounded in our path and to actually make greater strides in adopting the path that the Buddha taught. So Lojong as a genre of teachings has come to mean these teachings that are about 1,000 years old, rooted in the Buddha's teachings, but brought to Tibet by the great Lama Atisha. And he disseminated these teachings to his heart disciples, and they disseminated them to their disciples, and so on. And we have these teachings because of this rich legacy. And these teachings are difficult. I'm giving you kind of like in terms of the swimming pool, this is deep end stuff. Okay. This isn't the baby pool or the wading in. This is pretty deep end stuff. But I like teaching it even without knowing any of your backgrounds or some of your backgrounds, because it's rich. It really works. But it does take a little bit of courage. This is the willingness and the courage that we need to actually look at our stuff and to see that what is going on for us, particularly with regard to our problems, our difficulties, is very, very rich. It can do a lot for us if we're willing to open up to that. The very first thing that we have to recognize is that when we do have a difficult person or a difficult situation in our lives, we have to take ownership of that. This is your difficult person. We have a tendency to think, oh, we're going to let them go for somebody else. I remember Venerable Urbina, when she was in Santa Fe once, she did a teaching on generosity. And she was talking about how those folks who, we called them homeless then, I think it's more appropriate to call them unhoused now. But anyway, she said, if there's an unhoused person coming towards you, asking you for money, don't think that's somebody else's unhoused person. That's your unhoused person. That's who is confronting you and in your face. And you need to take that responsibility. Again, this is the way we want to look at it, is that it starts off with that very simple thought that we're not going to just wash our hands of it and kind of avoid it, but we're rather going to say, I'm going to need to be kind of curious about this. What is the situation going to teach me? I created this. And that, of course, is rooted in the whole idea of karma, which is a very kind of difficult concept. But if we look at it from the point of view, we often talk about it being the law of cause and result. The idea of cause is that we see that the states of mind that we bring often to our difficult situations. That's why I asked you to do a little investigation about your own comfort with working with difficult situations in the meditation. If we could look at the patterns that we've created, we can see that what we are experiencing is a product of those patterns. And maybe in this life we're a little better than we were in previous lives, but if we have some conviction that we've been around for quite a while, no doubt we've planted the seeds for many different things to ripen in terms of our experiences. So the causes are in our own minds. We don't really need to look further. We don't need to say, oh, well, what is causing this difficult person to be here? It's in our own minds. It's what we have created through our own habits, our own patterns, our own actions, and so on. But then when we look at the side of result, well, then this is the result of those causes. The person who is in your life right now who is difficult, challenging, somebody who you'd rather not deal with them. You'd rather go home, have a nice lay down or whatever you need to do and let them go. But they're there because they are a result that is exactly indicating what it is you need to work on. Kind of like think of them as a mirror. And of course, like in any mirror, we're only going to see what we're willing to look at. Sometimes you might glance at the mirror and go, "Oh no, I don't really want to look at everything else that's happened since, I was much younger, all the changes in my face and the wrinkles and the gray hair and whatever." Right? We can be kind of sensitive to that, but we need to look in the mirror and to really say, "Okay, what is this person, this result that I've created, there to teach me?" I remember the first time I came across Pema Chodron's teachings, and this is from her book, Start Where You Are. She says, karma is a difficult subject, but one of the reasons you are encouraged to work with what happens to you rather than blame it on others is that what happens is somehow a karmic result of things that you've done before. This kind of teaching on karma can easily be misunderstood. People get into a heavy-duty sin and guilt trip, right? Feeling that if things are going wrong, that means that they did something bad and they're being punished. And that's a misinterpretation of karma frequently that we have, right? It's like this retribution that we just keep, having to step in it because of some force that is punishing us for our bad behavior, and we're horrible, horrible people. Totally wrong view, right? She says that's not the idea at all. The idea of karma is that you continually get the teachings that you need in order to open your heart. I might add, in order to even develop our minds. Everything is a teaching for us. That's the Lojong principle, essentially, is that everything is there to help you in some way, to really give you exactly the medicine that you need at that moment. Which again, we can have a lot of resistance to, because there's times we don't feel like taking the medicine. There's times we don't feel like looking at our garbage, right? But that's what that person, that difficult situation is there for. You She continues just a little bit more of her wonderful words. She says, to the degree that you didn't understand in the past how to stop protecting what she calls your soft spot. Apparently, this was a teaching from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, her teacher. And I like this idea of the soft spot. The soft spot is that place from which all these amazing qualities grow, right? Our loving kindness, our compassion, our bodhicitta, this wish to benefit all beings by becoming a Buddha. This soft spot, we all have a soft spot. I mean, even when we hear these words, like when I shared that quote from the Dhammapada, and we that's touching the soft spot. That's getting through to that and going, yeah, that we know that to be true. We know that to be really resonant with our deepest sense of who we are. That this is where we want to come from, is from that place of that loving kindness and compassion, and not from a place of armoring ourselves and steeling ourselves against the world and in this dog eat dog kind of fight, right? And that's true for everybody. And even the people who have armored their soft spot still have the soft spot. They still have this place where they can get through, right? There's cracks in the soft spot. What is it? Leonard Cohen says, that everything has a crack. That's where the light gets in, right? There's there's some cracks there. I'm going to tell you one little story that I like sharing this story, and so you may have heard it from me before. Quite a few years ago, I had the honor of being at a teachers gathering in New York at Garrison Institute. And one of the gentlemen that was there was from the kind of insight tradition, but it was more of, I think even maybe working with Noah Levine and his organization, a lot of the kind of street Dharma stuff and that. And his name is Vinnie Ferraro. And Vinnie Ferraro's story is really quite interesting. He grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm not familiar with most of New England, so I always had this vision of New Haven, Connecticut being like a pristine little suburban area with nothing going on that was inappropriate at all. Apparently, it's really pretty down and dirty in parts of New Haven, Connecticut. And he was raised. His father was I think he said his father was a drug dealer. He ended up stealing drugs on the streets himself. He started hanging around with a lot of people who were really not up to much good at all. In fact, they were downright nasty in the things they did. He and his gang used to go out on evenings sometimes and beat up homeless people. And they'd have the baseball bats and they would just wail on them. The story goes that one night he was on this particular street and he saw this homeless man and he went up to him with the baseball bat, getting ready to hit him. And the man locked eyes with him and said, "Please don't do this to me." And Vinny said, "What makes you think I'm not going to do this to you?" And the homeless person says, "Because you have the most compassionate eyes I've ever seen." I mean, he dropped the bat, I think, he stopped. He could not do it anymore. He heard something that got through to that soft spot. There's a crack. There's an ability to get through even in these hardened cases. And my gosh, Vinny Ferraro is the sort of person that, I mean, we talk about difficult people. I mean, I would avoid him like the plague, right? And we would not want to be around him at all. Because when you see people who are working from that place of cruelty and violence, but there's a soft spot there. And it got through to him and he changed his whole life. Became a meditation teacher, became a Dharma teacher. So there's hope for all of us. And hopefully none of us are out with baseball bats at night, beating up on people. But, we do our own little stuff that we're maybe not so proud of, but we have that soft spot. We have that potential. So again, Pema Chodron saying that this is to teach you how to avoid what you did in the past of protecting that soft spot, protecting this place, a very tenderness and vulnerability. Vulnerability is a big word in the West these days, right? We all want to be kind of more in touch with our vulnerability, deeper sense of courage and source of courage in our lives, right? But we have to be able to go there. That's a hard place to go. And I find it kind of interesting because we're this whole topic of working with challenging people. I have a hard time working with challenging people. If I start working with somebody, who's like really in my face, I kind of lose it half the time. It's really hard to maintain your composure and to stay present with that. So I guess you teach what you most need to learn. So that's why I'm here today, maybe I can learn some skills from all of this too. But we all have that. We all have that soft spot, that place that if we can be in that place, then we find that everything else flows naturally. We have an ability to be much more responsive to what's occurring around us. The last sentence in this teaching, she says again, it was you didn't understand in the past how to stop protecting your soft spot, how to stop armoring your heart. You've you've been given now this gift of teachings in the form of your life to give you everything you need to learn how to open further. So this is kind of the initial framework that when we're approaching things from a Lojong perspective is that we go, okay, this is my creation. I can look from the side of my own causes, my own past patterns, my own way of behaving, and see that that's the source of what gave rise to this. And I can use that as a mirror to show me even more clearly what it is I need to work on, how it is I need to change, what it is that I can actually do in that situation that's going to, again, be much more responsive to what's happening, as opposed to being reactive. When I teach, I like to really delineate these two words because I think they're excellent words. Reactive. Reactive means you're going to be active in the same way you were before. Reactive. I'm just going to keep reacting the same patterns again and again and again. That's a definition of insanity, right? To keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. We keep doing it and we don't realize we're stepping in it once more, again and again and again. We're reacting. On the other side, there's being responsive, responding. And it's rooted kind of in that word responsible, right? I'm able to respond. I'm able to actually take this in and do something that is constructive with it. I know this isn't a technical dictionary kind of delineation of these two words, but as much as possible, I like to see the reaction as being the habitual thing that we want to avoid. That we want to change that pattern because that pattern isn't so helpful. That pattern just keeps getting us in more and more trouble and being more responsive. So we have to have a lot of tools to work with to become more responsive. Different ways of framing things, working with things, looking at things. And this is what I want to be spending most of the time on today, is to actually explore, and again, the more traditional ways, but even some things I've learned from some of this nonviolent communication and things that I've been working with in my interfaith work. Um, so, are there any comments from anyone in doing this initial investigation into your own kind of approach to difficult situations? Were you able to kind of see what your habitual things, your way of reacting? And maybe some of you have developed some skills around responding. But just, does anyone want to share anything from that investigation? Ah, someone online. Yes, please.
Hi,
Ah,
Don.
hey, Jim, how are you doing?
Long time. Haven't
Yes,
seen you
long
in a while.
time. You're
I
still in
fo
North Carolina, I assume,
yeah,
yes?
yeah.
Yeah.
I follow you around the country, and every once in a while, you have a teaching that I just couldn't resist going to this because I'm the one that you picked up that article from a Facebook post of
Oh,
mine.
what's it, your post? Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I had to verify it because I almost didn't believe it.
Yeah.
And NPR did the original article on it.
Uh-huh.
And what struck me about it was the lack of fear
Yeah.
in this man. He had no fear at all to do
Right.
this because nobody else is doing this that's African American. So, and then
Uh-huh.
there's also fear in the KKK of not wanting having, they have a fear of black people that isn't even logical. So getting
Sure.
the two together, they discovered that their fear was nonsense and they just made a connection. And
Yeah.
connection is the thing that keeps you from going off in these
Uh-huh.
situations. But I'll tell you, when you're in a situation and it's escalating, it's
Mm-hmm.
real hard to calm yourself down and get out of it. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost too late.
Sure.
So preparation through meditative practice is probably a good approach. It's like a
Absolutely.
martial art of sorts,
Mm-hmm.
where you're ready for things, but you're not uh, involved. You're not involved in the drama and the emotion of them, and you're
Mm-hmm.
um, it's that's where martial arts came from,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
from Buddhist monks, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing all that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, in the heat of the moment, it's pretty difficult to have the composure and the courage even to stand up to things. I might delineate to some degree, at least in our initial practice, we do have to be kind of concerned about two different aspects. Some discomfort in a situation is okay. I mean, that's how we really grow. There's that phrase that I think most of us have heard, right? That you don't really grow unless you get out of your comfort zone. We're all in their kind of little bubble that we like to be in, and we don't really want to push it too far, but you don't grow in that bubble. It's very hard to grow without things challenging you and taking you outside of that comfort zone. So discomfort is going to be a part of dealing with difficult people, challenging people. Absolutely. But if you are feeling like there's danger and a lack of safety, then for most of us, we maybe do have to be cautious then, right? It's not necessarily that we want to go rushing into that with, I always joke that like when ISIS was doing those horrible videos of like beheading Americans who, they captured, I was like, I can have a lot of compassion for those guys who are doing this, right? Because it's a horrific act that's got unbelievable karmic consequences, right? They're suffering in their minds doing it, and they're going to suffer greatly by doing it. But it doesn't mean I'm going to get on a plane and go to Syria or something and try to find these guys and say, try to convince them that they shouldn't be doing this. I'll be the next video, right? And it's kind of pointless, right? Because it's futile. I can't get through because probably again the obstacles are pretty deep there. I'm not the homeless guy looking up and saying you have the most compassionate eyes in the world and somehow getting through. And maybe I could do that, but I doubt it. So I think what I'm trying to say is that for every one of us, when we are looking at this subject of dealing with challenging, difficult people, we do have to have some delineation of where feel that some discomfort, and it's going to be that, no doubt. But when it becomes unsafe, then perhaps there are different steps that we need to take, like remove ourselves from the situation or be sure that we're not in a place where our safety is in danger. Now, again, if you're a really high practitioner, maybe you can do this. Remember, there's that wonderful story of the Buddha when this Angulimala, this he had a really bad teacher who told him that he would become liberated and enlightened or whatever if he killed 1,000 people and cut off the thumbs of each of them and kind of made a little garland, a mala out of these thumbs. Angula mala means, yeah, garland of 1,000 thumbs or something, I think is what it means. He had 999 thumbs when he came to the Buddha. He was told, he was trying to find his 1,000th person to complete this horrific task, right? And he approached the Buddha, and the Buddha was like, "Yeah, okay, come, you can take it." And he kept, like, through his magical powers, kind of going further beyond where he could reach him. And eventually he got him kind of worn down a little bit. And then he sat him down and had a nice talk with him. And he managed to change his mind completely, right? Well, if you're the Buddha, maybe you can do this with somebody who's out to like chop off your head or, take your thumb and, but I think for most of us, we have to be practical. We want to be here in this body with this life because we can probably do some good as long as we're, continuing to develop. So don't think that we have to be at this like extreme level of practice with challenging and difficult people. There are some people where, again, it might not be fruitful for us to be with them, but that doesn't mean you still can't learn from them. That's why I keep going back to, again, the teachings are telling us that these are our perfect teachers. Right, that wonderful verse from the 8 verses of thought training of Lojong by Geshe Langri Tangpa. Whenever I see beings who are wicked in nature and having great suffering, what is it? Overwhelmed by great suffering, I shall hold such rare ones dear, as if I had found a precious treasure. Right, that's a big thought. Wow, that's a really hard one to work with, but that's the whole range of people. The people who make us somewhat uncomfortable, all the way up to the people who are like really, really tough cases, right? And we really can't do much in our current situation to change them, perhaps. Changing them, I'm not necessarily, I mean, that's another thing we maybe need to set on the back burner. It's not about changing them as much as changing our own minds. And sometimes others change when we change our own minds. But that's not the end product. The main product is to get our own minds to change. But nonetheless, even staying with a difficult situation when it becomes dangerous may not be the best thing for us. And as Jim was pointing out, most of the work we do on our cushion And that's really what the Lojong teachings are primarily about, but it doesn't stop there. It's like you're out in the world and you encounter things and then you bring them to your cushion. And then you sit and meditate on them and try to frame them differently and work with these teachings. And then you get up off your cushion and you go back out in the world and you try to use those teachings in your meditation as a tool to change your own behavior. And sometimes other people change in response to that. But again, that's not the main objective. My objective isn't to get everybody in the world to be exactly the way I want them to be, all smooth and wonderful and nice. Again, those wonderful verses from Master Shantideva, I put them in my little notes here in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a wonderful chapter of Shantideva's text. Many of you know chapter 6 perhaps a little bit better because it's the one on patience, which is also very important. But chapter 5 is kind of like how we guard our minds. How do we make sure that our minds are protected when we're going about our daily life? And in that chapter, Shantideva talks about all the ways that you need to protect your mind. And he has this wonderful one that is about patience, essentially, but it's the way that we frame it in terms of it's all about our minds. It's not about changing the external world. He says harmful beings are everywhere, like space itself. Impossible it is that all should be suppressed, right? I can't suppress every harmful being out there, every challenging, difficult person, and get them to be loving and kind and sweet and smiley and everything, right? But let this angry mind alone be overthrown, and it's as though all foes had been subdued. And where does the foe or the enemy come from? It comes from our own minds again, right? So if we are able to subdue our own angry minds, then we don't have enemies and we don't have foes. You might have people doing things that in a conventional way are against your welfare, but they're not really foes because you're choosing not to see them that way. You're not going to get angry and upset in response to what they do. He continues and he uses this wonderful analogy. He says, to cover all the earth with sheets of leather, where could such amounts of skin be found? You know, California is not too bad. Down in New Mexico, where I live, I mean, you wouldn't walk out in the desert with bare feet because you would be, tortured. Just, all the little prickly rocks and things and cactus and whatever. I mean, you don't really want to be out there without something covering your feet, right? So you might have this idea, well, I'm going to cover the whole desert and the whole land with, leather. It'll be all smooth and nice. Anywhere I walk, it'll be wonderful, right? Well, where would you find enough leather to do that? And then he goes on to say, but with the leather soles of just my shoes, it's as though I cover all the earth. So wise up, just put the leather under your feet and then you can walk wherever you want, right? We cover our own minds and then we can go wherever we want. We protect our own minds and then we don't have to worry about what other people are doing per se because we'll be protected. We won't get angry. We won't get upset. We won't get inflamed by what they're doing. The last verse in this little section, this is verses 5, 12 through 13. He says, and thus the outer course of things I myself cannot restrain. But let me just restrain my mind, and what is left to be restrained? Now, again, I don't know Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is a wonderful example of somebody who I don't know. He may have incredible spiritual training. I don't know his background. There is, again, this documentary about him that I haven't had a chance to see yet. I think it's called Accidental Courtesy or something. It's kind of an interesting title. But the idea is that he's got something that he's going out there with his mind protected, where he's not going to get bent out of shape going to a Klan rally, even, right? I mean, how many of us, even those who are white in the room, as most of the KKK tends to be, would be very uncomfortable going to a Klan rally, right? And here is this black man who's willing to do that, right? So he's got some kind of training going on there. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know his background, but there's something that has been created in his mind to where he's protecting his mind. So we all have to learn how to do that. And again, the Lojong teachings are the means to do that, to kind of get out of our habitual way of reacting with anger, with upset, with resentment and revenge often towards others, and instead replace it with responses where, again, if in the moment perhaps we can't be buddy-buddy with that person who's really difficult for us, that we change our minds. So it's not so prickly for us anymore. It's not so challenging for us anymore. Now, in the traditional teachings, what they essentially point to is rooted in the Lam Rim. It's rooted in the stages of the path. I imagine that many of you in the room have studied the Lam Rim and know the the texts and the kind of topics that are in there. But there are a number of topics, and I just want to touch on these because I won't have time to go into all of them this coming weekend. I'm here in California in part. This was my first sort of invitation to come to California was Vajrapani Institute down in Boulder Creek, having me there for a retreat on mind training, on transforming problems, difficulties into happiness, into the path. And so I'm doing that next weekend, and I'll go into much more detail there. But kind of the first one that we can see that is really quite useful for us is to simply use that challenging person, that challenging situation as a reminder of what the Buddha taught in his very first discourse, right? That there is what he called dukkha. Dukkha is the Sanskrit or Pali word. They sound similar, spelled a little differently in English letters, but the idea is that this is pointing to the fundamental state of us being in an unsatisfactory condition. Sometimes it's better translated as dissatisfaction rather than suffering, but nonetheless, it gets translated as the truth of suffering. The very first, not quite first words, but pretty close to the first words the Buddha uttered in terms of a teaching. He said, there is suffering. This is the truth of suffering. We are in this unsatisfactory state. Well, it's when you're dealing with those difficult people, especially ones that are quite challenging, when it does get pretty heated and it's very difficult to react, we can see this is suffering. Just embracing it from that reality and saying, why did I expect when I got up today that everything was going to be wonderful? I'm in a state of dukkha, right? I keep stepping in the dukkha every time I turn around, right? There's always something more. It's kind of perpetual. And of course, when you understand the level of dukkha, that's why suffering doesn't quite work in that regard. It is everything. It's everything that we're experiencing because we're not in control of the situation. If you were in control of the situation, if you could get up in the morning and say, I am going to control it so I don't encounter any difficult people or difficult situations. I'm just going to live my life with just everything going my way. Traffic's going to go my way. People are going to get out of the way so I can go in front of them. We can't control even that traffic, right? Much less everything else that happens. So we end up kind of with the situation where things are happening that we can't control. Well, what can you control? Your own mind. That's a tough one, but that's the only place we can control. But this is what we're dealing with, the Buddha says, is an unsatisfactory situation. You cannot change all these external things that are going on. We can't make those difficult people into pleasant, wonderful people. Everything is going to, again, be a product of our own past actions, our own past behaviors, things manifesting in various ways. And we have to, again, go back to what can we really control in this situation? What is it that we need to be really focused on? It's working with our own minds. So again, that very first one, they often say that it kind of funnels it into this thought of what we traditionally call renunciation. Renunciation is simply, it's such a big kind of a loaded word in our English language, but it simply means, I've been there, done that. I'm sorry, but I'm just not going to keep doing it again. I've done it for way too long. Even just this life is way too long. And Buddha says we've had beginningless lives. We've been involved in this. We just kind of are up to here and we've had it and we're just going to do something different. And that's the impulse behind it, right? Is to actually want to do something different and to create something different. And that's possible through the Buddha's teachings. But we are still going to have to face all of this. One of the things I always have to remind people when we are dealing with any of these teachings around transforming suffering into happiness or transforming our problems, is don't expect the problems to go away. Just know that you've got more tools to work with them. Because as long as we're in this conditioned world, we're going to deal with stuff. And there's different interpretations of what happened in the Buddha's life, but it said that even in the Buddha's life, he had things that he had to deal with, like his cousin Devadatta, who was his archenemy, right? Even the Buddha, this enlightened being, has somebody who despises them, who's doing all this stuff to mess up their plans. Buddha's going about his day, and Devadatta causes elephants to stampede towards the Buddha, breaks up the Sangha, does all these. I mean, kind of bad karma for poor Devadatta. But the reality is that even the Buddha had to confront these things. Of course, the Buddha wasn't suffering from any of it. He'd long ago removed all of the causes of his own being in cyclic existence. He was here as a teacher. And this was a teaching, how to deal with those things, how to deal with unpleasant situations and unpleasant people. So don't think that as you practice this, that the difficult people fall away and they just don't become, they're non-existent then. And if that's happening, well, you can be happy for a while, but don't rest on your laurels because you'll have more difficult people, I guarantee. And if you need one, you can call me. I'll come be your difficult person. I won't do that for you, but anyway. Um, so again, this is the first one that is often really useful to work with. And it reframes the situation. It's like, well, what did I expect? Did I have expectations that I was going to be living my day without any of this sort of interruption, without people disturbing my peace? Well, is that realistic? Look at the world that I'm living in. Look at the world I create through my own actions and my own crazy mind, right? Of course, another one they say that is really powerful to work with is to diminish our pride. You know, pride is said to be one of the root delusions, the six root afflictions in the traditional presentation of Buddhist psychology. There are three kind of main ones that we're trying to counteract. But our pride is a big one because our pride really gets in the way of a lot of stuff, right? Oftentimes we feel kind of hurt when somebody has done something that damages our pride, right? Because we may not be identifying it as our pride at the moment, but it's definitely this sense of, how dare you do that to me? How dare you talk to me that way? Whatever it is. We might not even say those words, but that's the impulse, right? This is there's no way that you should be doing this to me. Well, that's a false sense of pride, right? Because once more, you've created the karma for this. This is your own creation. When we get into that dualistic thing of thinking this is that person doing this to this independent me that's over here and is totally a victim and da 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 da, and shouldn't have this happening to me at all, well, that's a distortion. That's not accurate. The most profound and extensive teachings of the Buddha is the whole law of interdependence. Things are always rising in dependence upon other factors and in an interdependent way. Why is that person harming you? As I said earlier, that's your difficult person. You created that difficult person in terms of being the recipient of their actions. They do have their own free will in a sense and are doing things that will, are harming you, but you're a part of co-creating that. And of course, you can also be a part of co-creating something different. But you have to make the decision. You have to make the choice. Oftentimes, the other person doesn't even want to make the choice or isn't even aware that there is a choice. This is one of the saddest things is that most of the challenging and difficult people that we meet don't even have an idea that things could be different, right? They just keep going on their habitual reactions to things and don't think that they could be otherwise, right? At least we've got these teachings, these amazing teachings that we can look at and go, I want to be different. I know I can do it. I'm just going to put more energy and time into doing it. But you can create something different at that time. And one of them is, again, to diminish that strong sense of why me and how dare you do this to me, the pride that arises. That kind of, it's quite humbling when suffering happens to us. And we've all been through some form of suffering that has humbled us, I'm sure, that has made us kind of come back down to earth and realize, we're not so wonderful. Tell you a little story about Venerable Rabina. When I was preparing back at Seichen Ling, one of the teachings that she did in 1997, I think it was shortly before I left for the master's program. And I was pretty not deeply entrenched in San Francisco, but I'd lived there for almost, 18 years or something. And I only a few years before that had bought a home, my very first venture into real estate. And I wish I'd held on to that home because I'm sure it'd be worth a lot more than I paid for it. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But I would go by the Seichen Ling. They were on the same street that I moved to, and I went and started going to teachings with Venerable Rabino. Well, I decided to go to this master's program, this 7-year training over in Italy. And so I was in the process of selling my home and quitting my job and doing all the other things. My partner, Patrick, was moving down to New Mexico. I mean, everything was getting resolved and it seemed to be getting resolved pretty easily. So Venerable Robina, before this teaching, she says, so Don, how are things going with all your preparation to go to master's program? And I said, well, things are going really quite smoothly. Everything. And I told her everything, what was happening and blah, blah, blah. And she goes, well, if things are going that smoothly, either you're already a Buddha or you're not practicing hard enough. I was like, oh, I know it's not the first one. I'm not a Buddha. So, you know, So, sometimes that's even what happens is that when we have this false sense of pride that we think everything is wonderful and it's all going to keep going this way and blah, 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 blah. But, and everything can change. And they actually even say that sometimes through the force of our practice, we actually do see things in our lives change in what might seem as a negative way. But it actually is a wonderful lesson for us if we can kind of be with that and kind of see what there is again to learn from that. But, expecting smooth sailing every day, you're only going to hit rough seas. It's not the way to go. So diminish our pride, make us much more realistic in what it is that we're involved in. So these first two are really quite nice, I think, to set things up and to give us a real kind of appreciation for what the Buddha is teaching us, the truth that the Buddha is giving us, that we really have to accept. That yes, it's not all about us. And yes, this is what we have to experience day in and day out, the state of dukkha, things being unsatisfactory. I remember one person told me, it says, I explained this to them and they said, wow, you Buddhists aren't really satisfied, are you? I mean, I think at some level, most people become satisfied with the unsatisfactory nature of things, maybe, and they don't want to do anything about it. They just say, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way the cookie crumbles or whatever. Maybe Buddhists are, like we care a little more. We'd really like to see things better. And so that's why we, maybe engage in trying to change things, is because we see that there is the possibility of things being different. But as I'm getting to, don't expect that things are going to be different immediately, because there will be plenty of suffering to work with, plenty of difficult people to work with. They're going to pile up. Um, and then I want to go on, maybe just spend a little bit of time with these are kind of, again, a bit higher teachings, but the teachings that help us to embrace others with more love and compassion when they're difficult for us. This is a harder one, but I think it's something we all can feel is useful, right? If we can have a little bit more kindness and compassion for those people who are harming us. One of the deepest levels of understanding that we have around others when we are dealing with difficult people is that they are under the control of their own crazy minds in the way that we are under the control of ours, right? I don't know why we have this expectation that everyone we meet is going to be like this perfectly in control, stable person that is going to be wonderful to be with, right? Because most people have their own stuff, right? They have their own set of delusions, different ones predominant and of different strengths. We have our own stuff that we're seeing more clearly if we're doing our work on the cushion and having some attention to. So why do we expect that everyone we meet is going to be just like so in control and wonderful, right? We're dealing with crazy minds. Their crazy mind is no different than your crazy mind. Again, might have a different mix of things, different levels of things. Everyone we meet is in the same predicament. So when we have that understanding, then we have a different perspective on why they're doing what they're doing, right? Master Shantideva is one on this. I didn't copy the verses. I'll just tell the scenario. He says, if someone is hitting you with a stick, right, you get really upset at them. And Shantideva says, well, but why aren't you getting angry at the stick? The stick is the one that's actually hitting your head, right? And you go, oh, but the stick's being wielded by the person, right? You don't have sticks just flying off the ground and hitting you in the head, right? The person is grabbing it and hitting you. And then Master Shantideva so skillfully says, well, then why aren't you upset at the delusions that are causing that person to to use the stick to hit you, right? Because the person's no more in control than the stick in some ways. I mean, we're in this place where we're separating, kind of the person and their actions from the delusions, the crazy states of mind that we all have. But the Buddha says that's useful because, again, this stuff actually is not who we are. I know that oftentimes we think of ourselves in that way. I'm an angry person or I'm a jealous person. That's just the way I am. You have to deal with it, right? It kind of takes those delusions and makes the person into the delusions in a very kind of concrete way, where we don't see that those are there. They use this wonderful word. They're just there adventitiously. Adventitiously means that they kind of have a presence there until something comes that knocks them out, in a sense. Without the antidote to them, without something that counteracts them, they'll hang out, sure, but it's adventitious. It's not there by its nature. Your mind is not anger by its nature. Your mind is not jealousy by its nature. It's the same for the people that we meet, these difficult people. Their minds are not anger. They might be manifesting angry thoughts, and angry thoughts might be controlling their behavior and doing all that. But the person and their minds are not those thoughts. It's a way of kind of giving some distance because the Buddhist path is one of being able to remove all that garbage. I often use the analogy of a glass of water, right? A glass of water has a natural clarity and purity. But if I, go out in the lot and find some dirt and I shovel the dirt into the water and mix it up, well, then all you see is the dirt, right? Because the dirt is kind of pervading the water and blocking that clarity. But then if I go and run that dirty water through a purifier, the clarity returns, right? The clarity is sort of always there in your minds as well and in the minds of others. We have that as our kind of the foundation of who we are, is this clear, pure nature. We often call that our Buddha nature. And we have all the sediment, the garbage that's polluting it at the moment. But that pollution is not your mind, just like the dirt is not the water. And it's the same again for everyone we meet. So when we meet people, that's the initial understanding. It's like to have better kind of sense of compassion, caring, concern for them is to see that this is not who they are. What's manifesting at this time, the way that they are speaking, the things that they are saying, we can actually see that there's something else there. Maybe this is what that unhoused man was seeing in Vinny when he looked up at him, and this like, you know, there's something pure there. I see that purity. And that's a wonderful view to hold. Maybe we can change some minds along the way by holding that view, but at least have that understanding. Because from that place of that understanding, then you have a very different way of responding to that person. Because you see that they're just a crazy, deluded person like yourself, dealing with their own battles, fighting their own wars, and we don't even know what their wars are like. This is one of the big mistakes I think we make, is that anyone that we meet that's a difficult person, we make an assumption that we know their whole story. No, we don't know their whole story. One of the exercises we do in this nonviolent training that we've been doing a couple months now. Well, actually, we started over a year ago, but then kind of fell off a bit when I wasn't involved, and then I got back involved, and we got a nice little team doing this. But one of the exercises we do is try to see things from another point of view. This is a really skillful thing that we can all adopt, right? When somebody is doing something, and maybe that you won't have time in the moment if it's a random encounter in a parking lot or something where somebody's being rude to you. But you can, if you sit down and think about it, find many different points of view that could explain why they're doing what they're doing. But we think we know. We think that we've read them already. What behavior that they're doing is wrong, and we're wrong, or we're right in trying to correct it or be kind of confronting it. But we don't know their whole story. I'm going to tell another story. Like when I talk like this, I don't even have some of this stuff prepared. It just when you start going, you do remember things. There's a wonderful teaching by Jack Kornfield about a student of his who was involved in MBSR. Most of you know MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. I am starting to talk really fast, Bay. Sorry. She was saying at lunch that my teachings are sometimes, I don't talk quite as fast as Venerable Rabina, but pretty close. And so anyway, I'm watching myself speed up today. But okay, so Jack Kornfield, he was talking about this student who did MBSR training. And of course, the whole point of that is that as you develop the skills, you can look at your mind and see what's going on and try to stop the behaviors and the thoughts before they really take root. I guess this man was in the military or something, and he was down at a grocery store somewhere in the South, and he's, in line behind this quite a long line of people in front of him. And it's, probably the time of day when everybody's grocery shopping after work or whatever, and just not the time you should be going into a store if you have problems with being patient. And so he was watching his mind get really annoyed, first at just the length of this line and how long it was taking. And then he goes, oh, yeah, my mindfulness-based stress reduction. Come back into the present, come back in touch and let it go, and I can be here and be patient. He gets a little further up, and then he sees that at the front of the line, up by the cash register, there's an older woman, there's the cashier, and then there's a younger woman who has a baby. And of course, there's all these people still waiting, still behind them. And the woman is taking the little baby and giving it to the cashier, and the cashier is holding the baby up and goo goo gaga with the baby and, kind of, looking at each other. I'm sorry, I had it the other way. It was an older woman with the baby and a younger woman. It's a cashier. I knew I was going to mess it up. Okay, so the older woman, after a while takes the baby and buys her groceries and she leaves. So this guy's like really perturbed by this point, right? What is this woman doing? Why is she like showing the baby, to this cashier and da da da? I mean, we're all waiting here. And he goes, "Oh yeah, my MBSR." And he goes back into his place of kind of being more mindful. So by the time he gets to the cashier, he's calmed down a bit. And so he asks this young woman, or says to this young woman, "Oh, that was a cute baby that woman brought in here." And the woman says, "Oh, do you think so?" He says, "That's my son. And ever since my husband died, my mother's had to take care of him because I've had to work 2 jobs. And so she brings him in here so I can see him during the day." And so when you hear that story, you like, we don't know the story, right? We think we know the story. We think it's just some random woman that's bringing in this child and this little interchange that's going on. But we lose our sense of creativity, right? We don't can't get creative in our own thoughts. We see it through our own blinders of our needs. And we might even think about the other people who are in line. Maybe we're also kind of holding their awareness, but we think that this is really inconsiderate and rude of this person, right? When actually what's going on is an incredible, precious moment of connection, right? So we don't know these stories. We do know that every one of these beings that we encounter that is difficult has their own stuff, right? Has their own delusions, has their own craziness. So we have to be prepared for that and kind of see that. And if we really understand that, then we have room for compassion and loving kindness, right? Because we see how much they are suffering. There's that phrase that I think it comes from AA: hurt people hurt people. The people who are hurt, people who are wounded, people who are damaged. Everyone raise your hand, right? We're all there. We're all wounded. We're all damaged. We all have, things that have happened to us. We hurt people sometimes. Every one of us has been a difficult person. I mean, we talk about this little time together today to talk about dealing with difficult people. We're the difficult people too sometimes, right? Like there was someone who posted on Facebook something very cute. It says, "That time when you find out you're in a relationship with a crazy person and the crazy person is you." You know? I think I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but we're the crazy people too, right? We have to be willing to accept that, right? So again, this is something that when we have this perspective, there's room in our hearts because we want to have compassion for ourselves. That's a kind of step we should have before this. I'm kind of jumping right into compassion for others. Self-compassion is really important, that we see our own stuff and that we actually look at ourselves through the eyes of compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh, the eyes of compassion. This is a phrase he used all the time, right? We have to look upon the world this way, but we have to start by looking upon ourselves this way. Have compassion for your own situation, your own crazy mind, your own reality, and by extension for others because they're just like you. There's no difference. Again, in the fundamental situation we're all in. Not talking about the degree of stuff because we can see the degree of stuff. It's very different for different people, right? But we're just like them, right? Compassion for yourself, compassion for the other person. But this is really where I think we learn to grow the most is when we can actually do that. Now, again, when we are able to, in challenging situations, muster up some sense of compassion for that person who's in our face yelling at us, well, then we might have very different ways of responding, right? Different ways of saying things and doing things. Maybe we'll keep our lips shut when we need to, when rather than always just needing to defend ourselves and assert our own sense of being right in that situation. We'll let go of all that because we've got a much more compassionate stance. But maybe we even will be able to kind of craft things a little better in terms of what we say or do at that time. Be much more skillful and not, exacerbate the situation. And when we do step in it, I mean, that's the one thing I learned. When I first encountered the Buddhist teachings, I was living in San Francisco and I was had a car. I would drive here and there. I wasn't driving that much out of the city, but when I would go out of the city, boy, you get on the freeways. And I think it's a zillion times worse now. There's lots of room for practice. That's just like a given, right? And so what I was seeing is I was starting to see my mind is that it would be like after the fact. I'd already have like honked my horn when the guy almost cut me off and maybe even flipped him off or done something, right? But then I'd catch it, at the end, I'd go, uh, I just did what I didn't want to do, right? We have compassion for ourselves, and there's room for that, right? To say, okay, I'll do better the next time. I'll do more work on the cushion. Next time I get in the car, I'll try to be prepared a little more, use my Boy Scout slogan, be prepared, be prepared. And then when something happens, maybe I'll be a little better at responding a little more quickly. I had one student that I was working with in Santa Fe who told me, you know where community college is out at where there's those roundabouts? You guys don't have many roundabouts in California. Maybe you do. Some, where you go up to them and you have to go around and the cars all have to be very courteous and, because there's no lights there. So they have them in Europe a lot. Anyway, he said that he came to one leaving community college and there was a car coming around and he probably could have made it, but he decided to be courteous and let the other person come by. And the person behind him didn't like this. And so started honking on the horn. And he looks in his rearview mirror and sees them. They're all getting red faced and honking on the horn, honking on the horn. And he goes like this, getting ready to extend his middle finger, but he doesn't. He's at this point with just his fist. And he told me about this, and I said, "Oh, congratulations." You know, he felt kind of embarrassed about it. And I was like, "You didn't extend your middle finger. Congratulations." Because yeah, I was thinking, I mean, what did the guy behind him think? Maybe the guy behind him has seen a middle finger often enough that he saw it there, regardless of whether it was there or not. But this is how we actually make some change. We have some compassion for ourselves and we work with ourselves. We might not live up to these ideals right from the beginning, but hey, nobody does, in my experience. We're all works in progress. We all have to kind of keep working at it. So we have that compassion with ourselves, and then we also have compassion for others, right? Because we see that when they're flipping us off or doing whatever, it's coming from their own crazy minds. And as I pointed out earlier, most of them don't even have an idea that they can change their minds. They don't have the skills or abilities that we're learning about and trying to cultivate by coming here today, by being involved with Buddhism. So I have a lot of compassion for them. Yeah, please, Peter. Oh, we've got a microphone here, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you, Bay. Yeah,
Will you just speak a little bit about
yeah,
Tonglen and how difficult people are opportunity to practice that?
yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I was going to bring up Tonglen as like the last way to work with this, but let's go into it. It's an extension of our compassion and loving kindness, right? Most of you have heard of this practice. This is a wonderful thing to do with difficult people. Maybe again, in the moment, it's very hard unless you're really well trained. But in terms of if you've got difficult people in your life and you really want to sit on the cushion and do a practice that works with them, then it's ideal. Difficult, very again, this is like graduate level practice pretty much. It's scary too. Tonglen, two Tibetan words that in the order that they're presented mean giving and taking. Tong is giving, Len is taking, but it's practiced usually in the opposite manner. Pema Chodron is a renowned teacher of Tonglen, and almost every book she's written has something about Tonglen in it. In our tradition, we more specifically use Tonglen as a part of our technique of developing bodhicitta, developing this kind of universal concern for all beings and a wish to develop ourselves to help them. So the idea behind it is that if let's use the scenario of a difficult person that is in your life right now, somebody who challenges you. It could be a relative, could be a coworker, could be a neighbor, could be a partner. I even find that I did one course on conscious relationships and I tried to work with the reality that the people that we often are in most intimate relationship with can sometimes be our most challenging person, right? Because they know our stuff, they know our buttons, they know how to kind of get to us. Whoever you're choosing to work with, you visualize that they're sitting in the space in front of you. And you begin to focus on first their suffering. And suffering doesn't just mean, oh, when they have a headache or when they, get a hangnail or whatever the case might be. It's looking at the whole picture of like them in this situation, dealing with their crazy minds, saying and doing things that they would regret afterwards, whatever it is that you think about them. And again, the way that they're from that place of suffering, dealing with you, talking to you, behaving with you. Again, we're not doing this to get rid of all of that. We're doing this because we want to generate greater compassion for that person. So we see the ways that they are suffering. and we really focus on that. That's the initial part of the meditation, is to like feel that it's almost, palpable, the suffering that they're going through in dealing with their own crazy minds and whatever. Then you begin to generate the wish to have that be gone. And I like to think of compassion being generated in at least three thoughts. Sometimes they include a fourth one. The very first one is how wonderful it would be if this person was free of that, didn't have to deal with that at all, right? The second one is, may they be free of that. As they say, this is like you're the ruler of some domain and you're like setting forward that decree. May that actually happen. It's more powerful than how wonderful. How wonderful is kind of like, oh, how wonderful it would be if I had ice cream right now. May I have ice cream? I mean, it's right. It's a little more powerful. The third one is to take personal responsibility for that, to say, I will free you from that suffering. I will do whatever it takes to remove that suffering, even if I have to take it upon myself. Those are the sorts of thoughts that become this kind of courageous compassion, bodhicitta essence, the bodhisattva's way of living their lives with that kind of courage and determination. And again, it's harder when this is somebody who we might have, a lot of history with that is not so good, but still, those are that's the real grist for the mill. It's those people who have been pushing our buttons and still are pushing our buttons that we really want to be able to learn from, right? So generate those thoughts, and then you begin the process of visualizing, taking away their suffering. Again, there are many different techniques taught on how you can visualize this. Um, the one that tends to be more prominent in our tradition is that you first think that what you want to overcome, which is our tendency to be very self-centered in our lives. We call this often the self-cherishing mind, but it's the fact that we do still, in the end, most of the time, think about me, myself, and I much more than we think about others, right? That's the reality. We all like to think we're kind of compassionate and caring, but at the end of the day, I need mine too. We really come from that place of self-centeredness. That's kind of the enemy we want to place all this suffering on. That's what we want to get rid of. So you start visualizing that you can use the breath. I find it really quite vivid with the use of the breath to breathe in all their suffering. They say you can breathe it in the form of like a black smoke, something that is really not so pleasant. And you take it into your heart, into this, and kind of surrounds this mass of like coal or rock or whatever it is that you visualize this as, and it begins to eat away at it. And you bring more of that in and it eats away more. Some people say you just bring it in once and it completely destroys it, but I like things that are a little more gradual because it is challenging. How can I be with just removing a little bit of their suffering first and kind of taking that on and feeling my self-centeredness kind of release? That's what the feeling should be like while this is going on at your heart. Just like, okay, I can let go of my desire to not experience that. Then you bring a little more in and you begin really releasing a bit more of that kind of stinginess and self-centeredness. And then eventually you can bring it all in and you can feel wonderful that you've removed all of the garbage of that person and taken it upon yourself. Not that you become a more messed up person because of it, but you you instead have kind of dissolved it all into what makes you better capable to benefit others, getting rid of that self-centeredness and being more other-centered, and being more focused on others' needs. That's the whole alchemy of Tonglen. As Pema Chodron, when she teaches, she says, we normally do the opposite, right? We'll give everybody all the garbage and we'll take all the delicious stuff for ourselves. But that's only feeding our self-centeredness, right? That's only getting us into the tighter and tighter circle around me, myself, and I. After you feel like you've done this for this being, then you start focusing on their well-being. Because although you've gotten rid of that kind of crazy mind and what have you, you haven't made them into the kind of full potential that they have within them. You haven't brought that to full blossoming. Their full potential is to be a Buddha, to become this magnificent being who is imbued with perfect love and compassion for all. So you begin to think about them in that terms. You look at them as somebody who would ideally like to be very happy, who would like to be in a state of well-being. And if they were in a state of well-being, they wouldn't be a difficult person for us, right? They'd be this content, happy being, right? That we would get along with perfectly. So we start generating the thoughts of loving kindness towards them in that way. First, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness, all the causes of happiness. Second, May they have that. Third, I'll do that for them. I'll give whatever I have so that they can have that. I'll give up my own happiness, my own welfare, again, going against the grain of my self-centeredness in order for them to have that. So then we start sending that out. Now here, Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, you imagine your whole body turned into like a wish-granting jewel, this mythical jewel that is supposed to, kind of fulfill the wishes of all beings. I like to think of it as at my heart. Sometimes I even use that analogy, like this being coal. Remember how coal turns into a diamond through that kind of compression? So it's like we bring in all that suffering, it compresses this, and then in the space of that, this beautiful, multifaceted diamond, this clear, crystal clear jewel is there. You take everything that you have that brings you happiness, all of our kind of positive potential, all of our resources, all of our friends, everything, our body, all of that transforms into brilliant light that gets infused in this jewel, whether the jewel is your entire being or whether it's just at your heart center. And then you begin sending out that light. And on the exhalation, that light goes forward. And initially, it might become just what's needed for the temporal well-being of that person. Giving them better jobs so that they're not so grouchy all day or whatever, all the things that kind of make them into a better person in this world. But then you keep sending it out. So it becomes the causes for their ultimate well-being. It starts to really become teachers and dharma and everything that will change their minds to the greatest degree. We really want that for them. We want them to totally transform their being into this perfect state of Buddhahood. So they've gone from being this miserable, difficult, awful person that's, causing us problems into a fully transformed, enlightened being through the course of our visualization and through our willingness to take away what pollutes their minds and give them what will be the sources of their ultimate well-being. Again, it's a very powerful practice, but very difficult. They often do say to start Tonglen with yourself, visualizing yourself in your own crazy mind and crazy situation, and really wanting that for yourself, kind of taking a more objective look at yourself rather than the subjective tendency that we have of thinking that's me. You look at yourself as that sentient being, and then you work with yourself first, and then you gradually can get around to working with others. But it's really hard just to jump right to like the most difficult person in the world, fill in the blank, whoever that is, that is your person that even when you hear their name said, it's like hair goes up on the back and you just want to like scratch them or eyes out or something. Don't work with them first, perhaps, because there's too much emotion there. Start working with the little things and build up your stamina, your ability, your courage. Then you can work with the tougher stuff. But thank you for bringing that up because it was a perfect segue. Peter's a plant. He's here. keep me on. Keep me on. Not a house plant. Yeah. Peter and I met so many years ago in San Francisco. It's wonderful to see him again down here. Yeah. Um, so maybe I can pause for a few questions. I do want to spend a little time talking about just kind of these practical skills too. I mean, this is highfalutin stuff. Lojong is, like I said, it's incredibly practical, but it is high level practice stuff, especially when you get up to like the Tonglen and things like this. But if you use it, it's so effective. It cuts through the nonsense really, really quickly. Yeah,
I
Peter.
just want to say I spent 20 years scared to death of that practice.
You spent 20 years scared to death of it.
Scared to death to
Oh.
try it because I thought I would take it on and stick to me, and then I'd really be in suffering.
Yeah. Pema Chodron in her book, No Time to Lose, she talks about one of her teachers. She doesn't identify the teacher, but she says her teacher was asked this question, like, from a concerned student who said, if I practice this way and say I'm working with somebody with cancer and I breathe in their cancer, well, then I'm afraid I'm going to get this. Aren't you afraid that you're going to get this? And the teacher said, nothing would make me happier. I mean, that's what we're aiming for, is that kind of level of practice where we would be delighted if we could take away someone's cancer. I mean, I'm putting that out there as a bar, okay? Don't think that that's where you have to be right now. That's kind of what we're working up to, is kind of being able to have that level of kind of courageous compassion. Yeah, Venerable
When
Angie.
Kirti Sencha Brimshe was a great guru who used to come. Did you meet Kirti Sencha?
No, I never had that.
Anyway, he was a Kala Chakra, a real high Tibetan yogi Lama, the top of the top. He was a teacher for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he said, too quick, too fast. I'm faster than Dawn.
Yes.
He said, he was in Israel when there was a lot of unrest, maybe around 2006, 7. I mean, there's continually unrest over there. So there was a period when there was a lot of unrest, and he was teaching over there, and he manifested sickness, being quite ill. And I think, anyway, he had to go to the doctor, and he said, when the doctor diagnosed him with cancer, he said to his attendant, I think it was at the time, the doctor was so kind. That's what he just felt, the kindness of the doctor when he told him he had cancer.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think it was, from my surmise, it was probably these lamas do a lot of tonlen, and they're at a level where they can actually take on these things, So I thought he probably took on something.
Yeah.
So, some of the turmoil there, and then he was like, almost like, wow, my practice worked kind of thing, and the doctor was so kind to tell me that, that, oh, wow, it's worked. So that's kind of how I understood.
Yeah.
So, but again, that's like a very high level of practice, but we can rejoice.
Sure. And I think, again, for most of us, that is not the big concern that we're going to get this by even having these thoughts, because we just don't have that level of practice. Our compassion isn't that developed. So I wouldn't be, you can be scared of the practice to some degree from that perspective. But that's the whole point. Once I go back to what I talked about towards the beginning of today, discomfort, right? We have to kind of be willing to deal with some discomfort to grow. The only way you're going to grow your heart is by being willing to go beyond the boundaries of what you find safe and comfortable. So we work with it and we get there gradually. But yeah, these are some pretty high level practices these bodhisattvas have that are just way beyond where we're at. You were going to say something more, and then we'll come to you in just a moment.
I just want to point out it's my self-cherishing that's afraid.
It's your self-cherishing that's afraid. Yeah. No, this is it. I mean, it's all this ego stuff, right? That we're holding on to this sense of an I and this identity. This is one of the deeper ways that we work with Lojong. We'll get to that this weekend at Vajrapani, but the emptiness teachings, to really see that it's all revolving around this false sense of an I, and that dictating our needs, right? Because that's what's going on. I need this. I want that. Everything to satisfy this fictitious I. Yeah. Can we just had? Oh, sure. Yes, please. There was a question up, but we'll go ahead with you. Yes, please. I just wanted
to clarify. I thought I understood you to say that when you take on someone's suffering, you are dissolving it. You aren't taking it on yourself, as it were. So this cancer example, it's not like you would get cancer. It's that you would dissolve it. Is that?
Well, it's kind of both in a sense. I mean, again, if we're doing it without some willingness to experience that pain, like to say, and let me dial it back a little bit. Let's talk about, I don't know if you were a parent in this life. Were you a parent of a child? Well, perhaps you had a situation, I know many parents have, where they've been at the bedside of somebody who was really quite ill. I mean, their child who's feverish and really quite, and maybe you've been at the bedside of someone else who you cared about deeply, or dealing with a pet who's really quite ill. And I would bet that most of you have had the thought of, I would rather have that illness than they had that illness, because you see them in their suffering. And because of your close connection to them, you feel a willingness to do that, to have that thought. Again, it doesn't cause you to have the illness that that person has, but it's equally powerful, because you would gladly change places. You would gladly be the person who has that. So I don't want to say that it's completely just dissolving it and not really feeling it at all. It really has to be a sense of like, I would take that away from you. Now, again, we can see, and that's the challenge, right? Because we can see that for people who we're quite close to, we could do that. We could do it for our pet or our child or our partner or someone who we're very dear to, our parents. But when it's somebody who's the challenging person, are we really willing to take on their stuff? I mean, I might be giving away my political opinions on things, but I remember hearing when Dick Cheney was having a lot of heart problems and things, my immediate reaction was, I won't say, but then you go, wow, I should be using him as my, try to bring in Dick Cheney's heart problems, and I'm willing to take away Dick Cheney's heart problems so he can be free of them. It's hard when you start dealing with the challenging people. Hold on to your thought, Peter. Let's get the question back here. I don't want to. You'll be able to do that. Yeah, you got your thought. Okay, good.
Hi.
Hi.
Maybe I'm a little confused in terms of what you were saying, the love of a mother to a child, and you're gladly, would like to take the pain away,
Sure.
and you have it. What happened with attachment?
Yeah.
I guess that's the concept of attachment, and then being being
Right.
compassionate, and
Right.
I would like to.
No, that's a very good question. What's your name?
Patricia.
Patricia, yeah. I mean, when we talk about that level of kind of just concern for only those that are in our immediate circle, there's an attachment together with that. But I think when it comes down to those sorts of thoughts, it's primarily love that we're having, or compassion in a more genuine way, because we are really so concerned about the suffering of that other being that we would be willing to take it on ourselves. But absolutely, there is attachment in those relationships. And that's why the circle does have to be widened. We can't just stop at caring about the people who care for us. The people who care for us, it's a given, they're in that circle already. They're going to get our love and compassion generally. But the people outside of that circle, first the strangers, the people that we don't know, that are just people walking on the street and people doing whatever, that we generally like blinders on, we don't even pay any attention to them. We don't have much concern for their situation at all. But then the difficult people we're kind of talking about today, that are in this camp of like causing us pain and challenging us in different ways, that's an even harder one to open our hearts to. So yes, we have attachment for the friends, and we have an indifference for the strangers, and even an anger or aversion towards the enemies. All of those need to be gotten rid of. And there's wonderful techniques in Buddhism to work with that, developing equanimity. Probably have heard of this term, equanimity. It means to have an even-mindedness towards all of them, so that we would be willing to go that far with our compassion and love to embrace their welfare as well as those that we're close to. But absolutely, attachment can be a problem if we only stay in that circle, again, of comfort, where I'm having compassion for the people who have compassion for me. It becomes very much about attachment and about my own welfare. Frequently, wouldn't say all the time, but most of the time. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up to clarify that. Yeah. Peter, still have your thought?
I just wanted to say Dick Cheney's a little outdated.
Yeah.
Donald Trump with financial problems.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Peter was saying Dick Cheney's a little outdated, so I can think of Donald Trump and his legal problems, financial problems, whatever. I mean, I can. But this is true. And again, I'm regardless of what side of the political fence you're on, there's always grist for the mill. There's always people to work with who are on the other side of the fence. But seeing them as difficult people is, again, we have to get rid of maybe even some of that label and kind of recognize that we're all difficult people, and we're all dealing with our stuff, and we're all kind of, again, in the same boat, in the same predicament. So that we see that wherever you're at, there's always somebody that's there, that's kind of this counterforce, that's sort of your thing to work with, your person to work with, your idea to work with. So we don't get into this kind of dualistic stuff around us and them. It's rather we're all in this same predicament, regardless of who it is that you choose to work with, regardless of regardless of what you identify with, what pole of the spectrum in terms of various things, you are gravitating towards. You are still no different than anyone else. And those people are no different than you. But it's a hard one to get to, to kind of be willing to look at that other side, whatever. And again, I want to clarify, though, that we're once more not in the position where we're simply saying, and because that's so, anything they do is fine. That's not the point. Actions and the people who do them are two different things, right? We can have compassion for the person who does it, but we can take offense at the actions that they do. And we can do what we can to get out there and be a counterforce to those. But don't hate the person. Don't lock the person out of your heart, because that person is actually, again, just like you. And moreover, is a great teacher. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm just a little bit confused about the physical, when it's a physical ailment like cancer, right? And
Right.
you
And
and
breathing.
you breathing in, and
Mhm.
if it actually does happen, does that person that you're doing that for, does their cancer go away? So does that do them good by you taking on? Am I understanding correctly where you actually?
Again, but we're just, what's your name again?
Peggy.
Peggy. Hi, Peggy. I think once more we have to recognize that the people who have an ability to do that, to actually take away the suffering of another being or kind of have that manifest in themselves, it's pretty high level stuff. So don't think again that and again, you might all be Buddhas for all I know, so I don't know your level of realization. But I would say for most people who consider ourselves kind of ordinary folk, we don't need to be as concerned about taking on someone's cancer when we're breathing that in or whatever, but we still should have that mind that is kind of willing to go there, willing to entertain that thought. But they actually do say that in situations, I think this may have been Togme Sangpo. There's stories about Togme Sangpo and his incredible compassion, bodhicitta. I think he was doing Tonglen around a dog that he saw that was being beaten. And it said that he was able to kind of take on that pain and the dog not experience it. His Holiness, I think it was in the teachings on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, another Lojong text, where His Holiness says it made him wonder where that person, where Tokme Sangpo would feel it if the man was beating the dog's tail, because we don't have tails, right? So anyway, it was kind of funny. His Holiness was joking about that, but no, I think this is really high level stuff. People who can do this. Curious, yeah.
Do the person good.
Yeah.
Does it actually take away their
Yeah.
cancer when you take it
I mean,
on?
it said that in some cases it does. In some cases there is that ability, but it's a pretty tough one because again, the other side of this that we always look at is that there's the karma for that being to experience that pain, but there can be an interruption to that karma based on, again, the intervening of some being who has some extraordinary power due to their own realization. But it's pretty rare. I mean, don't think that this is happening every day, because if it was, I think we would, be in a very different world. But yeah, maybe you've got
Actually,
stories.
it's a
Please,
personal
yes.
one.
Yes, please.
But so Lama Soprim, she's our teacher, Dawn and I, a few of us here, Peter. So one time I stayed at Lama Soprim's house in Washington, and I was having a lot of health problems for the last year there. I had lost a lot of weight, and I was having a lot of stomach, digestion, these kind of problems. And then one day, this was probably 2010. One day I was upstairs. One of my jobs was to take care of Rimshi's rooms and do all the offerings. And Venerable Holly was Rimshi's secretary. And so, of course, at that time, we didn't have a lot of all these iPads, WhatsApps and all that. Still didn't have that. But Rimshi had called the house, or somehow Holly was talking to Rimshi, was in, I don't know, India or somewhere far away. And I mean, it's not that I spoke to Rimshi very often on the phone. Rimshi was a really high Lama, So, but this day, because Venerable Holly would speak to Rimshi a lot on the phone because she was the secretary, for Rinpoche and the organization. And so one day I was doing the bowls and then Holly came up, Rimshi's on the phone, and I'm like, oh. And I was having a lot of stomach pain. I was really struggling to do the bowls, I was really in a lot of pain. And Rimshi knew my health wasn't good because he had been at the house about a month or two before. And I was kind of almost not able to do. So Rimshi said, how's your health? And I said, oh, well, I've got a bit of stomach pain right now. And I mean, again, it was very rare that I had a conversation with Rimshi on the phone. When I came off the phone, my stomach pain was gone.
Yeah.
And I knew, then I was like, oh my God. I mean, it did come back later because it was more chronic. But at that time, I just knew that Rimshi had done something, he had actually done something, in that moment to relieve the pain. And that's something other people have mentioned somewhere, a severe headache after speaking to Rimshi, something moved. So again, it's Dawn's saying, when you've got a high level of bodhicitta, you can do it, and that I definitely knew Rimshi at that point had done something. So it's quite amazing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Venerable Angie. Yeah, no, so we get personal testimonies to some of the effectiveness of this. But again, the most important thing when we're embracing it, I mean, we can have that desire of obviously of doing that, but don't be disappointed if you can't remove the suffering of another. It's mostly about transforming our own minds. And then as we build up that ability, then you can perhaps do that, like Rinpoche does. Yeah. Peter, yes.
Tonglen is the deep end, but you've given us a practice that's before that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Directly from Lama Zopa Rinpoche.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never heard it before. It's where you become the jewel of wish fulfillment.
Yeah.
And just to try to hold that space to radiate like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's
very powerful.
That's a big one. You know, and again, these thoughts of loving kindness and compassion that I was talking about in the context of Tonglen, you can have all the time. I think, was it Richard Gere? I think Richard Gere has been a student of His Holiness and Lama Zopa's and Rinpa Rinpoche, all these amazing lamas. But in the video that we use for Discovering Buddhism, the Bodhicitta module, he talked about how he decided one day he was going to make his heart practice where any person who he met, be him a difficult person or be it a stranger or a friend, his first thought before any judgment, before anything else, was, may you be happy. And that's like really transformative. If your first thought, any being that you meet, it's tough practice, right? To do that with every being you see or meet, to hold that thought, may you be happy. You can have the same thought of compassion, may you not suffer. Whatever it is, that's the same kind of being wish fulfilling, being something that will become the means by which others can experience that. Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop ourselves so we can be this catalyst. We can't actually change people again. That's the unfortunate thing. If we could all be changed into Buddhas by Buddhas, then we would all be Buddhas by now because Buddhas would have done it, right? Because that's the level of their compassionate concern. But can we be a catalyst for others? Can we be something that quickens their path to attaining their ultimate well-being? And so we do that through changing our thoughts about them so that instead it's like, oh, I think that person's up to some no good and that person looks like a real jerk and whatever. I mean, lots of internal dialogue, right, about whoever it is that we meet. Just change your thoughts. Just start having more positive thoughts towards others. Sometimes, again, I'm not saying your goal should be to make all those people wonderful and delightful. It should be to change your own mind so it doesn't matter who they are because you're wish fulfilling for them. You're just going to continue being who you are in the face of whatever it is that they are. And your concern, your compassion, your regard for them is equal. It's not, oh, I care about these people, but forget them. Other questions or comments? Yes, please.
No, this is has been very helpful. Thank you very much. And again, I see the last point. There's a figurative aspect of it, and also it's more like what you're saying is about. It's not about hey, if I have cancer, I should go looking for some guru. There are a lot of them in India, by the way. A lot of billboards. They can cure anything.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily go there, but I think your point is more about the other side, like or for like you said, your mind. One of the question, or more for comment rather than question, is part question, part comment. One of the things I used to think about is like if there's a difficult person and you're responding in a way, or the thought I would have is, I don't want to feed the beast. I do not want to feed the beast. I don't want to make this person, like whatever that behavior stronger, that person thinking, okay, whatever that is, it's working. So I should, encourage a person to keep doing that way. Of course, now I'm slowly I'm trying to change that because realizing that no, I'm not, again, I can't change the other person. So either in a good way or a bad way, I can't feed that beast. I mean, I can't change that beast, but I can't feed that beast either. I'm thinking more that way right now.
Right.
It's helping out, but and also give a 1-800 Buddhist number. But that was more of a joke, tongue in cheek. But that's I don't know if you could comment a little
Sure.
bit more about that, that, hey, if my action is feeding the beast,
Right.
that thought.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that that's a good way to approach it, to look at it. And again, that can be rooted very much in our compassion as well. It's not that, again, because if we, as you call it, feed the beast, or if we inflame their anger further or their difficulty, make them into something that only gets more and more defensive in the face of our reaction to them. It's not that we're going to be receiving more stuff from them that we should be concerned. We should be concerned that they do this more, that we're actually causing them to increase their own habit, to make themselves suffer even worse, because, and that's the real challenging thing, is that when we see people through the lens of compassion, through our eyes that are concerned about their welfare, then we would do nothing. We would never want to do a single thing that in any way aggravated them or made them worse than what they currently are. And in fact, we want them to even be free of all of that and to not have the crazy mind that causes them to do or say things that are harmful to others. So absolutely, I think that this is a good way to look at it, is that why should I throw gasoline on the fire, essentially? Why should I be the one to just cause more pain and suffering for that being that's already in such a difficult place? So I'd want to see it primarily from that vantage point, rather than, I mean, it might start out by saying, well, yeah, I don't want to do this because I don't want to keep receiving stuff from that person. I don't want to be on the receiving end of their anger and their craziness and whatever. But really, we should have a greater concern for them too, because they're only creating unhealthy patterns. Yeah, please.
Right. No, I makes sense. And the other thing I was thinking about actually more about was when feeding the beast, in the sense, if someone is making you do something, that you don't want to, let's say, why don't you call me every day, or whatever it could be.
Right.
And if I say, okay, if I call every day, am I giving into that person where now that's what I'm calling feeding the beast, where
I see.
by agreeing to something, now that person is now being encouraged to do more of that, which
kind of,
may, right. So, and again, I think, but I do, what you mentioned, I think applies to that also, because it's, if you look at from a compassionate angle, right, is this going to make things worse for this person?
Sure.
Because maybe it's attachment that's driving this person to say, call me every day.
Right.
I'm talking about my mother, by the way. Sorry.
No, I agree with you, and I think again that it can be like that, where we're just not wanting to increase the unhealthy habits of other people or whatever. I think we have to be careful. I mean, there's this wonderful set of teachings that Lama Zopa Rinpoche gave at the Light of the Path, the very first Light of the Path retreat, which was in North Carolina in 2009. And he talks about, because a little bit of what I was getting from you, and I don't know, I was reading into it probably, was this idea of being taken advantage of, which sometimes comes along with that, right? Like, like somebody says, well, would you call me every day? And we're like, well, I don't want to be taken advantage of. But he said bodhisattvas, he didn't use the phrase want to be taken advantage of, but it's pretty close to that. He says they want to be used. We have this idea of, I don't want to be used. But if we are really thinking that we're of service to others and that we really want to increase their happiness and well-being, well, then we don't mind being used. In fact, we want to be used. Now, again, it takes a fine amount of wisdom and discriminating wisdom to know when perhaps our being kind of in that pattern is whether it's useful to the person or not. Maybe we are feeding patterns of attachment that might need to be addressed, that could be addressed if we were a little more, had some boundaries around things. And I know boundaries is a big issue in our culture, and I'm not trying to say throw out all your boundaries. Just see your boundaries for what they are and see if there's some wisdom behind your boundaries. If we feel like we're having the boundaries because we don't want to be used or taken advantage of, then maybe we need to do a deeper investigation and see what that's about. If we are actually willing to help others with their stuff and are in a good position to do that, then maybe boundaries might be useful, because then they can see, well, yeah, I can address my own attachment, but I think it's really hard depending upon the situation. Yeah.
What I heard is also it's like an experimentation also, like, like try something, see what happens, evaluate it, change be willing to do that is what also heard.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Definitely kind of be willing to, yeah, kind of try different things and see what works. Because we don't know. Often we don't know what's best. We don't even know what's best for ourselves half the time, much less for other people, and how to help them with their stuff, but yeah, I was really taken when Rinpoche said that in his teachings of like, we want to be used. Bodhisattvas want to be used. I mean, it means we want to be of service. We want to help others in whatever way is necessary. And there's all these stories in the Jataka tales, the stories when Buddha was like the Ruru deer and all these things where he was like at this incredible compassion and a willingness. I think the story with the Ruru deer, isn't that the one where he goes to break up the hunters that are fighting or something? And it was just a ploy they did to kill the deer or whatever. I mean, or something like that. There's one of the stories. And he just, again, it's hard when we hear these stories about like how much pain we might have to go through to get to the other side, but that's the only way through. I mean, we are going to have to look at our own stuff and our own issues and confront some of that. And difficult people are sometimes the best for that. Before we conclude, I want to just make sure I have a little bit to share, just one little 3-step thing that we use in our nonviolence training. And this is, again, often much more beneficial if you have a little bit of space to do some reflection. It may not be as useful if it's an in the moment type thing. Like I said, the random stranger in a parking lot who's accosting you because they didn't like the way you parked your car or whatever. That can happen, right? And it's maybe a little more challenging. But if you do this on a regular enough basis, I think it can become habitual. The very first step is to kind of, practice slowing down and generating self-awareness in regard to our own feelings. We oftentimes are just coming from the place of our emotions and our feelings, but not thinking about what's really going on there. And in fact, one of the things I owe some of this to my co-facilitator in this training, a man named Ramos Sotsi. Ramos has done a lot of work around nonviolent communication, much more than I have. But he says that we don't have a very good lexicon for our feelings. I think Brene Brown did a recent book called Atlas of the Heart, where she talks about kind of different emotions. And, when you kind of try to get at what is really going on in my mind, it's easy to get really buckety, like, oh, it's discontent. Well, but get at a deeper flavor of that. What's really going on? Is it some frustration? Is it some dismay? What is happening to you? And if you stop and really pay attention to your emotions, that already is kind of giving you a little distance, right? Because it's no longer the emotions themselves running the show. It's you taking charge of examining what's going on, being aware of your emotions. I'm using emotions or feelings in a much broader sense than what we tend to in Buddhism sometimes. But, that's our Western language, right? We know all of our feelings. Feelings, nothing more than feelings, that song. But anyway. All right. Step 2 is to be curious about what's happening in your own mind. I'll give you an example of all these when I finish. But step 2 is kind of like, what are the thoughts that are going on? Once more, it's taking a more objective look at the subjective things that are arising in a particular scenario, with a difficult person. Because this whole thing is like a technique for dealing with kind of diminishing conflict with others. The third step is an action, and not just any action. Again, this is an action that you would take in a nonviolent way to address the feelings, the assessments, the thoughts, everything that we examined in the first 2 steps. So the first 2 steps are to get us more in touch with our emotions and with what's going on in a more objective way. And then secondly, at the thoughts that are arising, that are accompanying those emotions. In Buddhism, we would lump those 2 together often because we just kind of think it's all sort of the same thing. But I think we can still delineate those. Let me give you the example that we use in this workshop. Say a neighbor confronts you with the accusation that your dog is pooping in their yard. Okay. Maybe you've been the person who's had the dog poop in your yard, but this time you're the one whose dog is doing this, according to your neighbor. Your neighbor's coming up to you and confronting you with this. So step 1, again, you might have that sense of frustration or even of this sort of self-defense thing arising, right? That, how dare they do this to me? Maybe some pride's arising, something like that. The first step is just to see what emotions are going on there. Take an inventory of that so that you kind of are aware. awareness usually gives rise to some level of wisdom. If we actually are not just following our emotions, we get in trouble when we just follow our emotions. We let them lead us into things. So that's the first step. The second step, in terms of this neighbor confronting you about your dog, is the thoughts that you're having. And your thoughts might be something like, oh, I'm sure it wasn't my dog. You must be mistaken. It must be somebody else's dog, right? And then maybe another thought is, well, I don't even hardly know this person. Why are they choosing this to be the way that they are neighborly to me? Like this is their first contact with me, to come up and start accusing me of my dog doing something, right? Maybe you have other thoughts. Again, these are just examples. But really take a look at what are the thoughts that are driving you at that moment. That, again, are generally the thoughts that are going to feed into an unhealthy reaction, right? Because if I think it's not my dog and this person's being kind of a jerk to confront me on this or whatever, then I'm going to be much more defensive in what I say, right? The third step is then, based on your assessment through those, what your feelings are, being honest with yourself in regard to that, your thoughts, then what is a more appropriate action to take at that time? That's, again, we're coming from the angle in this training at nonviolence, nonviolent communication, being able to say things to others that are not triggering for them, not be perfect at that yet, again, because we don't know all often, but from our place of, being, from our own minds, we're trying to put forward something that is much more constructive. So an example for this might be you take a breath and make sure that you understand the neighbor's concerns. I mean, really say, what is it that you're concerned about in regard to this situation, or how can I help? Really being attentive to their feelings, because they're having feelings too. They're going through their own stuff too. And I think that this sense of having kind of a curiosity, this is a word Ramos uses frequently in our training, and it's a wonderful word. Just saw there's a new book out called Seek or something, SEEK, about curiosity, and curiosity being an important thing to have. I mean, can we genuinely be curious about that other person? And that can influence that third step, our actions. I know there was a friend of mine in Santa Fe who had a dog that I guess was a bit frisky and liked to play with other dogs in ways that maybe the dog's owners didn't appreciate. And so he would take his dog to the dog park. And he had people coming up to him sometimes and saying, "Is that your dog?" Blah, 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 blah. And they start mouth. And he found himself, he didn't want to get into this whole argumentative thing, right? About and your dog, and why are you doing this? And da, da, da. He would say, "What can I do for you?" Oftentimes when we throw a question back at somebody who's being very difficult for us, it changes the dynamic, right? Because we're no longer foot in the ground making statements about our position and putting them in their place. We're actually being curious. We're being inquisitive. We're like, well, what can I do for you? Kind of putting the onus back on them to some degree. And it does shift the dynamic really quite profoundly, because suddenly the person's looking at it and going, well, what are my needs? What is it that I really need right now? That's very different than the emotional stuff that's going on, right? Because our emotions might be coming from that place of our needs, but the needs are often not communicated. It's the emotions that get communicated. So it's just a little, again, three-step technique of first, what are my feelings that are going on that are arising on the basis of this event? What are the thoughts that are accompanying that? And what is a more appropriate kind of nonviolent action that I can take in this time that will be respectful to both parties? Yeah, Peter.
Apologize, I have to leave.
No worries. Okay.
I have to babysit my grandson.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
But I wanted to say the Buddhist answer is,
Uh-huh.
Bodhisattva answer is,
Uh-huh.
oh, I wish you had more than 1 yard.
Yeah. So it's too funny. Oh, Peter. Thank you, Peter, for being here. So any questions on that technique? Because I want to make sure that that's kind of clear. Again, very simple thing. What we have people do in the exercise in the workshop, just so you know, is we give them different scenarios then. And then they sit in a group and they do the self-reflection first, where you sit down and you write down each of these three things in regard to your own imagined responses to a situation that we put forward for you. Then you share it with others so that you can kind of work on, well, what is the action that we feel most fits into something we would call a nonviolent response to that scenario. And it kind of helps us to get into that space of thinking that way, so that hopefully when we do confront something, and yeah, I mean, as Jim was saying earlier, I mean, it could be very difficult and very heated and very challenging in the moment to do something because we need the training. Well, this is the training. And use those three even with situations that you've been in. Say somebody did accost you in the parking lot and said something, and see what your reaction was afterwards. Try to go back into that moment and see, what were my feelings? What were the thoughts I was having that fed into that? What would have been a more appropriate response? It's the only way we change is if we start thinking about how we would do things differently. It's kind of common sense stuff in some ways, but at the same time, people appreciate this sort of training because it gets them into the space of how do we work with conflict? You know, how do we actually develop some better ability to have something to draw from? I think that's one of the most frustrating things is when we're in that situation, we go like, I don't have anything to draw from. There's nothing there, you know, well, and maybe we even have these teachings and things we've been doing, but they feel so distant at that time, primarily because of these thoughts and feelings. The thoughts and the feelings are what often gets in the way. Anything else? I'm so glad that you all came today and that I had an opportunity to be here with you. So thank you again for making this happen. We didn't do any sort of prayer at the beginning of today, but I think it's nice to at least do a little bit of a closing in terms of we had our time we spent in meditation with generating a good intention to be here, to develop our own skills so that we might deal with more difficult situations and people in a kinder and more compassionate way for ourselves, because we will benefit from this, but also for others, that eventually may we be able to develop ourselves completely so that we can be a source of wisdom, compassion, love, and light in this world for all beings. And we can dedicate also for the good health and long lives of all the amazing beings that we benefit from in this world. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, all the other beings that we consider to be spiritual lights of this world, guiding us and others on our path of full awakening. We can also dedicate very strongly for the very swift return of our precious spiritual director, Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that through what we've done here today and all of our efforts, that we will be reunited with him in a form where he can continue to guide us and all beings on our path of awakening. And then any other beings that we want to dedicate for, we can include them at this time. Maybe even think about the difficult people in your life, those who are a bit more challenging for you. And they could be people that you don't even know, but that are political figures or world leaders or whatever. Send this positive energy out to them so it becomes a cause to help them to waken up to their own potential, to actually find true happiness and peace. And may all beings experience the same result through what we've done here today. Thank you all again. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Thanks again, Bay.